Welcome again, everyone, to the Uplink. I'm your host, Frank Mong, COO of Helium. By day, I work at Helium. By night, I'm a radio talk show host. Or in this case, a podcast host. No, I'm not, but I'm going to try to be aspiring career. Well, hopefully we have a great show today. I think this is a super interesting topic that we have. It's called Decentralized Marketplaces. Before we continue, I just want to give you guys a couple of housekeeping items. This is a tool called Zoom that we're using for the first time, so we're having some technical difficulties. But if you're on the call, you should be muted, hopefully. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box. We are monitoring questions and we'll take them as they come. And we'll address the questions towards the end of the program, as we have a lineup of conversations and discussions that we want to get through first. So let's start with the introductions. First, Amir Haleem, co-founder, CEO of Helium. Amir.
Hi. As Frank mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of Helium. We started this business almost 5 years ago and really aimed at trying to solve this problem of making it easier to build low power connected wireless things. We think it was an extremely underserved market 5 years ago and still think it's a completely underserved market today. And so that's why we continue to do what we do. Before this, I was heavily involved in the video game industry, both as a game creator, but also as an esports, I guess they call them athletes now, but back in the late 90s, that wasn't really a thing. You were just kind of you're a weird person if you played games at that level. But so yeah, I have a heavy background in video games and no background in IoT, although I've been doing this for 5 years now, so I consider myself somewhat educated about it. I'm also the least interesting of the two panelists today, so I'll let Sally say hi.
And yeah, Sally, please introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Salle Yoo. I am the former CLO of Uber. I joined Uber in July of 2012 when it was about 100 people. I employ 102, and I left last December, and really had a great opportunity during those 5.5 years to learn about marketplaces and about technology and the intersection of two. I started off this year with a spreadsheet of the things that I wanted to do. I'm taking a break, which I feel very fortunate. And one of them was blockchain. So I want to say thank you to Amir and Frank for inviting me, because this kind of gave me the kick in the butt to kind of make sure that I start that progress towards checking that one off. Fantastic.
Well, no, thanks for joining us, Sally. Thanks for coming back from the beach and actually doing some work. We appreciate it. Well, Sally, let's start with you, because part of the conversation about decentralized marketplaces really kind of lends to the analogy of what the companies like Uber and Airbnb have done, which is create a two-sided marketplace. Why don't you talk about how sort of in early days Uber had to tackle that two-sided marketplace problem?
Sure. So I think some of you might remember what life was like before Uber. It's interesting because I have two stepsons and they don't, but before Uber, you had a couple of options for transportation, but no good way of actually understanding where they were in relative to where you were or the pricing. I mean, you would have some relative understanding of pricing, but on taxi, it was metered, and so you knew generally what it was, but if you wanted to get a black car ride, it was unregulated, and so it was what it was. And so what Uber basically did was create a way for drivers and riders to get connected, and then it created an algorithm that would connect drivers and riders based on their proximity to each other. So creating efficiency in connecting drivers who had a ride to give and riders who needed to go someplace.
Very cool. Amir, how is that analogous to what Helium's trying to do?
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things in IoT, and so first of all, IoT, I think, is a pretty broad term. It means almost nothing to depending on who you're talking to. But the world of IoT that Helium is focused on is this world of like very low power connected things, right? And we think that's the most underserved of the IoT problems. And part of the problem that you have in this kind of use case is that these devices tend to send very, very, very small amounts of data. Right? These aren't the kind of devices like an iPhone or something that are transferring lots and lots of data, and therefore the carriers can charge lots and lots of money for access to those networks. And so what we've seen over the years, when we started Helium, what we really wanted to do was try and build wireless networks, like almost like a carrier. But the problem, like you quickly run into, is that people are only willing, like device creators and users are only really willing to pay cents or maybe $1 or something per year to have that thing connected, because it's sending data very infrequently, it's sending very small amounts of data. And so what we've sort of come around to doing recently in the last year or two is really thinking about how we can build a decentralized wireless network, or what we're calling a decentralized machine network, which is designed for these low power small devices, by basically removing ourselves from the process, right? Like we have no intention or desire to make money from the business of being a network carrier, because we don't think that's actually a profitable thing to do. And so what we aim to do is use a blockchain and a crypto economic incentive effectively to like incentivize other people to build this network for us. So it's an odd model by most accounts, because most people, I think, look at this business and think like, okay, if you're a network carrier, you should make money being a network operator. But that's not how we view it. And we don't think there's any, that the economic incentives are completely misaligned in today's world, which is why there's still this gap between people wanting to connect low power things and the availability of networks to do that.
And we talked about, sort of before the start of this conversation, incentives. Because I think part of the problem in both two-sided marketplaces, whether it's an Uber ride-sharing marketplace or Helium's decentralized machine network marketplace, is this concept of incentives to kind of solve this cold start problem. So Sally, you want to give us a little bit about the incentives problem or solution in this case?
Sure. And I think that when I think about incentives, it was a journey for Uber. And actually, before I go further, I'm putting my lawyer hat back on. I should just be clear that I'm not speaking on behalf of Uber. These are my views, and I'm speaking from my own experience. But in the early days, I think the incentives were straightforward. Riders had a pain point. The SFMTA had published a study in the 2000s that said that on Friday night from 6 p.m. till midnight, your chance of a no-show was higher than 70%. And so, I don't think you need to say more about what was the problem there. And then from riders, they also had an incentive. If you were in the black car business, then you had business in the morning and in the evening, because those were the commute hours, and then you had a lot of downtime. And so really what Uber did was it gave you an opportunity to increase your efficiency. What we saw in the early days was that drivers could earn up to 30% more. So again, that is taking an investment in an asset and recovering 30% more. So for drivers, that made a lot of sense. But I think that as the market evolved and as more participants came in, you have to constantly look at those incentives and make sure that they are aligned, and also be very clear about the problem that you're trying to solve. For us, what we really wanted to focus on was, making it a really good customer experience. I think that everyone loves to be picked up, really, in the shortest time possible. And then also, I think some of the corollaries with your marketplace, Amir, is just, we tried to create a trust. Right, you knew what the pricing formula was going to be, and then later on you got the upfront price, and then you got a receipt, so you knew that the route was what it should have been. And so again, that level of transparency created trust in a system that in the past had been rather opaque.
Yeah, and that's interesting. As you guys were tweaking that model, I'm guessing understanding the incentive wasn't something you guys necessarily plan for exactly. I'm guessing there's lots of trial and error there as you guys were pushing and pulling those levers.
Yeah, and I will say I was not on the business or technical side, so I'm not the person who has the best knowledge of this. But from what I observed and what we experienced was, I think many people who used Uber in the early days know that we used an algorithm to try to match supply and demand. So where there were places where there were a lot of people asking for rides, but not enough vehicles to meet that demand, then we had the option to switch on what was called surge pricing. And that would in an algorithmic way, would ratchet up and ratchet down to create more incentives for drivers to go to the places where riders needed rides.
Hated surge pricing.
I know. So that's the kind of learning that we found along the way, which is customers really didn't like it. And so you saw us evolve to a period where we got to upfront pricing, we just told you, right? And that was a much better experience. But again, those are things that you learn as the marketplace evolves, because it was a new thing.
Even though the surge was built into the upfront price, it just feels better somehow.
Yes.
You feel calm about it.
And I think you can understand that it is, because your trips don't always cost the same thing.
Yeah.
True. Into that vein, Amir, in that concept of incentives and solving the cold start problem for a truly decentralized wireless network, what does that mean for Helium and potentially users of the network?
Yeah, I think our problem, unfortunately, is a little bit harder, or I shouldn't say harder, different from Uber, in that there's in Uber's case, you sort of have this built-in, there's a problem sort of built in there, and there's excess capacity that you could have taken advantage of. And so there was a sort of very, very elegant solution there. In our world, from my viewpoint, IoT is nowhere close to where I thought it would be, right? I think Frank gave a talk recently where the expected outcome was the Jetsons, but by now, we're almost at 2020, which was always where like sci-fi movies had like magical things and people flying around and stuff. And it's still really more like the Flintstones or something, right? And I think that's part of the problem, is that you have this severe chicken egg situation, right? Where people aren't building the things that we would have expected them to build by now, right? Like our office here in San Francisco, still pretty dumb, right? If no one's in the conference room, the light is still on. And yes, there are solutions to that, but they're not pervasive and they're not widespread and they're not cheap enough, arguably, to spread that way. And so one of the things that I think has been really interesting, and I think blockchains and ICOs and token sales are largely bogus, and there's a lot of questionable behavior going on in that industry. But one of the most interesting things to come out of it is this notion of being able to at least assist with the cold start problems that people have in situations like this. And specifically in our case, it's like, how do you build a wireless network that's broad, that's massive in scope, that is cheap enough, such that people would be interested in building devices that use that network, right? And so you've got this, if I use an example of like a tracking device or something, right? I think everyone has seen like a variety of the Bluetooth trackers and sort of wished that they just sort of worked wherever they went, right? And that's how I think it should be. But to build a network that actually supports that, and to do it that's in a low power way, that's extremely cost effective, where you aren't passing a lot of cost down to the end consumer, is extraordinarily expensive, right? So there's no good way of solving that problem up front. Someone either is investing tens of billions of dollars on the hope that there's a marketplace for that, or they're trying to take the approach that we're taking, where we think that we can use the combination of blockchains and crypto economic incentives to incentivize people to build this network with us, right? That we don't intend to own the network. We understand that as a result of being a decentralized marketplace, we in fact disown it. We have no control over it. We have no say over it. But I think it's the right way to build a network that's truly driven by market economics rather than arbitrary carrier pricing. And so that's what we're trying to do. And up until now, I don't think that was really a viable plan. Like blockchains weren't a thing in the way they are now. Cryptocurrencies weren't as sort of understood and accepted. And so I think it has the capability of being an extraordinarily elegant solution to what has been a problem that hasn't been solved in the last decade, and hopefully we end up in the Jetsons or something.
Sure. And so in the world of Uber, you have the drivers and you have riders that need a ride, and the drivers are going to fulfill that. In the world of Helium, how would that look?
Yeah, our drivers, I suppose to use the analogy, are miners, right? They're gateway operators, right? They're people that buy gateways, which are sort of a physical, they're like a Wi-Fi access point, except instead of creating Wi-Fi coverage, they create many, many square miles of wireless coverage for these kinds of devices. So those are our drivers. And our riders are customers that are building things on the network. And so those might be tracking devices, they may be temperature sensors, they may be humidity sensors. I always use this example of about a year ago, there were some serious wildfires in Northern California, and they got very, very close to my house, like 4 or 5 miles away. But no one had any indication of what the air quality was anywhere around our house or our neighborhood. The nearest weather monitoring station was 30 miles south, which just seems ridiculous, right? And so you hope for those kind of devices to become cheap enough and easy enough to build. I think cost is one factor, but sort of ease of deployment and ease of tooling and all that stuff so that it's more like a software development experience than it's a hardware development experience. But that's who I would equate to our riders, is companies and enterprises and developers and makers that are looking to build stuff that take advantage of the network existing.
And then they would pay the gateway owners or hosts, in this case, a small fee to use that network to communicate back.
Yeah, so the gateway operators, may earn tokens in a couple of different ways, right? One is this concept of mining, and so we've invented this new system called proof of coverage, which is very different from a proof of work kind of system that Bitcoin or Ethereum or lots of other networks use. And the aim there is to sort of prove that everyone in the network is acting honestly, and the gateways are really where they say they are, and people aren't faking it. And they get rewarded for that as they continue to prove that they're acting honestly. They earn tokens. And then the other way is exactly what you mentioned, right? As if a device comes near your gateway, it has to use it in order to send and receive data to the internet. That gateway operator gets paid, and they get to decide what that pricing is. Okay, so it's a little bit similar to what Uber was doing there. They say, I will accept 5 tokens to send data to and from the internet, and the device says I'm willing to pay 3 tokens, and then nothing happens, right? But if they agree on the pricing, then data gets sent to the internet. And the device operator pays the gateway host, and that's how that. And then on the others.
Yeah, that's a real foreign concept, I think, for most people. Right?
Oh,
it's probably very difficult to understand, because I don't think it's ever been done before.
Yeah, I mean, I think typically that if you looked at the IoT space, or maybe the LP-WAN space might be a better way of describing this, but you've got businesses in that space that are I don't know how to say this other than traditional companies. Mm-hmm. You've got semiconductor companies, you've got network operator companies, and so their business models are reflective of that, right? If you're a semiconductor company, you're going to try to figure out a way to sell more chips, and if you're a network operator, you're going to figure out just how to charge money for people to use your network. And so this notion of just giving away the sort of crown jewels there is sort of an insane idea, right? In that model. But we think it's the only sane idea, actually. We've got a completely different approach on this. And having spent now 5 years looking at the space, you can sort of see how this is evolving and some of the struggles that these other businesses have in how to make the business model work, or how to absorb the cost or the capex of building a network like this. But yeah, very unusual, extremely novel idea, we think, but certainly untried and untested.
In the sort of, as this is a super novel idea, what Helium's doing, I think Uber had a very similar novel idea, new business model that actually, I think, was something that regulators and governments and sort of culturally society wasn't ready for. And you saw that, Sally, sort of in regulations and laws and guidance from regulating bodies that handled what was ride sharing in the past with taxi service and so forth. How is that, what's the impact of innovation in that sort of uncertain regulatory environment? Because I think you kind of dealt with that every day.
I kind of lived it.
Yeah.
So I think, as I'm listening to this, kind of thinking about, it's not a perfect corollary, some of our experience. I think, there are several inflection points in the Uber story. And one of them was, as many people know, when we started, we were just with Black Car. So these were licensed limo companies who already had a license. They were limited depending on where you were in the state. And contrary to the popular lore out there, we would actually go and hire lawyers and look at the regs before we went into, in the early days, we would go and take a look at the regs before we went into a marketplace and get their opinion as to whether this was green, yellow, or red. And it was usually green because these were licensed limo drivers, right? They already had a license. So, but that's limited supply. So that's only certain, amount of inputs into the system. What was really a game changer was when, ride sharing. And I think most people probably know this. We were not the first ones into the space. And I will be upfront with the fact that when I first heard the story of, that there was other companies out there doing ride sharing, I said, that's nuts, right? Who's going to get into a stranger's vehicle? Well, it turned out that a lot of people would, as long as you solve the safety aspects. And again, safety is something that you have to continually monitor, get better at. And we learned some hard lessons along the way. But, we started off with background checks and making sure that we had an insurance policy in place. And then what ride sharing did was it brought in an influx of supply into the system, because now you didn't have to have this professional license
as long as you had a driver's license and a vehicle that passed inspection. And then what California did was it set up a regulatory structure. And then what we did is we took that and we based the regulatory structure that the California Public Utilities Commission had created and created our own model regs. And then we started kind of going everywhere in the world and saying, we think it should be regulated in this way. And so one, I think just to circle back, one, there needs to be an incentive and an ability for more participation in the marketplace to create the virality that actually creates a healthy ecosystem. And then two, having some sort of regulatory framework. One, it does take time, but it actually helps because it creates certainty in the marketplace. I think, your marketplace may be different because the trust and the transparency that's in the marketplace, maybe, that in itself is okay. But I think that for some players, they need to have some understanding of that regulatory framework before they will enter the marketplace.
Yeah. That's a really good point, because I think that applies to what we're dealing with, and not necessarily Helium and IoT and blockchain, but I think in blockchain as a whole. While security and transparency and trust is part of the tech itself, I think what's missing is this regulatory concept as it relates to a decentralized marketplace. And so Amir, that's something that I think not just Helium, but any company that's trying to leverage blockchain as a key feature or a key benefit outcome is dealing with this uncertainty around regulation, right?
Yeah, it's really hard. As Frank and others know, I spend an extraordinary amount of time on this particular problem, like a D-grade securities lawyer or something. By now, it's hard. I mean, there is no real clear guidance on how to structure these kinds of businesses. And I'm not even necessarily talking about token sales and ICOs. There's just the whole notion of, how should you treat these tokens? Even if you didn't want to sell them and you just wanted to give them away or let people start mining them, that's also not entirely clear. And so you've got this big sort of ecosystem of advisors and counsel that sort of operate in this space. But because there's no clear guidance, they sort of take public statements from the SEC or the commissioner or whoever it may be and react to them. And people's reactions are very different. Like I speak to many, many different firms. And the sort of interpretation of what an SEC commissioner may have said is wildly different, right? And so you've got 10, 15, 20 very, very respected firms giving 10, 15, 20 completely different opinions. And it's, the consequences are no joke, right? At least if you're trying to do this properly, if you're actually trying to operate a real business that has utility and you don't intend to disappear to the beach of Alexandria or whatever it was that the scam guy did recently. Then you have real consequences, and so you're not anonymous. We're not just some names. We're not aliases in a Telegram chat. We're actually running a real business with real intent and real utility and real investors and real people involved. And so the level of care and precision that we're trying to take almost is an impediment for us versus the other guys who just sort of run quickly and just do whatever they feel like. And so there's some days where you're just wildly frustrated that people have gone and raised, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in these token sales. And then there's other days where you're sort of glad you didn't do that because people end up in jail, right? And so, but it is a challenge. I wish there were better guidance on how to do this for folks like us that are really trying to do something that has real utility. We're actually really trying to solve a big, important problem. And we have customers who agree that that's a big, important problem and are excited for us to deploy the solution for them. And we're trying to figure out the most sane or safe way to navigate that. So it's a little bit similar to perhaps what you guys are dealing with, just at a different, maybe a different level, maybe the same level. But the dealing with sort of cutting edge regulation, I think, is challenging. And I have tremendous sympathy for the SEC and the other regulators on the other side, because I think they really do want this kind of thing to work, and they understand that there is actual real value here in some of these applications. Yet at the same time, there's also a lot of fraud and there's a lot of questionable practices going on. So I get it. I just wish we had a clearer understanding of how to interpret the rules.
It's almost like, Sally, to your point earlier, it maybe just takes one regulatory body to have an aha moment, and then if you can convince them to sort of spearhead something, then the dominoes start to fall, and you can use their regulatory whatever you call it, guidance or law, and make that the framework or make that the example or template that you can take to other cities, other states, other countries, and say, here's a framework that the state of California adopted to work for them. Perhaps this is a good starting point. Because I think it's difficult for not just lawmakers, but these are elected officials that are laymen. They don't necessarily understand tech. They don't necessarily understand all kinds of different business models and economies. It's hard for them to understand how to regulate it, right? So it's good to come to them with hey, here's a template. This is what worked for this particular situation in this government body. Maybe it could work here.
Yeah, no, that was definitely our experience. I think it is difficult, for us. I think kind of, understanding that the SEC has certain responsibilities. And like you said, one of the responsibilities is to ensure that fraud doesn't happen on consumers. But if you look at the PUC, the responsibility was public safety, right? And so understand the lens of your regulatory agency. At the same time, the technology far outpaces regulation, right. Which is the place that we found ourselves in. And in that case, it was helpful, Frank, that we had a regulatory body that had, we could say, hey, they spent months looking at this issue. Here's where they landed. Here's what we think should be changed because, for these reasons. And then, here's what we would like to start with. And I don't know what the current count is, but, as of the end of last year, ride sharing was regulated in most states in the US. Right? Either at the state or at the city level. Mm-hmm. It did take some time and it's frustrating because again, they're trying to make sure that they land in the right place and the technology and the thinking is evolving. And let's just be honest, like blockchain is hard even for techies, right? And so, this is not their their top job. And I'm sure they're getting some really good people who understand it better. But it's not the easiest problem to solve. And yet it could also have really worldwide ramifications.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're fairly sophisticated. I mean, looking at the things that they say and they released an entire, I don't know if you saw this, they released an entire fake token sale. They called it Howie coins, it's named after the Howie.
This is the SEC.
Yeah, the SEC created an entire fake, coin, and it promised all these returns and it walked it, and then at the end it was like, you're about to be scammed kind of thing, don't do it. And so I think they're quite sophisticated about the problem, and I sort of appreciate the perspective that they have, especially in the face. I mean, frankly, the industry is not helping itself, right? Like there's so many scams and questionable projects, or things that you look at it, you're like, why would you ever need a blockchain in this kind of application, right? And so, to some extent, the industry I think is not helping itself, right, by doing that. So I have tremendous empathy for the task. I think it's just a challenging one, and unfortunately requires a tremendous amount of patience to withstand. But I think we'll get there in the end.
Yeah, one of the things, Sally, I think that's interesting is as in the beginning when the company set out to solve a simple problem, which is get people rides when they need them and have the rides show up as anticipated. What are some of the unexpected outcomes of what Uber has done versus the anticipated outcomes?
Well, I think as the business evolved, there were interesting learnings along the way. And I think one that we think about is, and kind of to this regulatory problem is, when ride sharing happened, the insurance industry was very, very concerned. They were initially concerned because they were concerned that their personal lines insurance, our car insurance, would get hit on because now drivers were doing both personal trips and what they considered commercial trips. And so we would go into the regulatory bodies or the state capitals, and the insurance lobby would be against us. And so we spent a lot of time not only educating the regulatory agencies and the regulators, but really with the insurance. We created our own insurance group, and we spent a lot of time with them. And then really what came out of that is they created products for our industry, and they became advocates and also collaborators in solving problems. I mean, if you saw the story in France, where now there's a product that gives drivers some of the social benefits they would have, if they were employees, I think that again is a way that the industry kind of, a side industry kind of evolve and then created again and solidified this marketplace. I think that you know, we've learned, but again, there's just so many things, like the things that we talked about, you know, surge pricing from a algorithmic perspective is, and from an economic perspective, is almost perfect. Writers hated it, right? And so again, trying to fix that problem as we go. And those are things that, and I think we learned some of the lessons that some of the other tech companies have learned, especially in the last year, which is not only to look at how it could be used, but how it could be misused, and not anticipating that or not spending as much time there. But you know, when you're growing a company, you're just trying to grow it and trying to make sure that there's more virality on the system.
Yeah, you know, one of the things I think for Helium, which is on the intersection of blockchain and IoT, I think it's in its very infancy, Amir. Given that, what do you anticipate the effects could be? I mean, you kind of alluded to the Jetson, but what are sort of some of the unexpected, you know, unknowns as of yet?
Well, they're still unexpected. Yeah, I suppose, otherwise I could expect them. Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I imagine that you know, when I first got into this 5 years ago, so Sean Fanning was my co-founder from Napster, and we would just chat like 5 or 6 years ago about what we expected it to be like, right? Like what we thought it should look like when IoT was sort of mature and big. And you know, I think you'd hope that it looks like something like Demolition Man or something, you know, like where you walk into an apartment and everything just sort of knows you, and you just have more. I think businesses can operate, and maybe this is a good corollary to Uber, but I think everything can operate more efficiently and more safely and more betterly, you know, with more data. You know, and the more that we know, and the more that we learn, and the more that we can interact with things, I think the better things get. I mean, we at Helium spent some time in like the healthcare space, for example, and you know, it's sort of shocking that the requirement there is still only that they have to check that drugs are stored at the right temperature once every 12 hours. You know, so you've got these like huge gaps of time where like it's sort of completely unknown what's going on there, and the same in the restaurant industry or the food industry and the whole cold chain and supply chain, and like there are just so many aspects of everything that we interact with every day that either are safety issues or efficiency issues, or just sort of convenience issues that I think could be significantly better. And the state of play today, to me, is pitiful given sort of where we are in other levels. You know, like we have computers in our pocket that are, you know, thousands of times more powerful than a space shuttle computer. Yet we still don't really know anything about, you know, where our food was or where the drugs were at the right temperature. You know, it just seems odd, you know, and I think a lot of the problem that I've observed or that we've seen at the company is sort of on the one hand is this sort of network coverage related thing. Like you need ubiquity. Like imagine if you had an iPhone and it only worked where you had access to Wi-Fi. It would be not a particularly compelling product from a consumer perspective, right? But then on the other hand, you also have this problem of making it easier for people to build things. And that was really sort of one of the most compelling reasons for us to start this business, was that if you looked at like an Uber being a good example, right? Like when Uber was being built or the app was being built, no one had to think about building like servers and TCP/IP stacks. And like, you know, the levels of technology sort of beneath what you were doing were obscured away and abstracted away over years and years and years of development of technologies like AWS and Rails and, you know, TCP/IP itself. And that hasn't happened in IoT in any way, right? So the level of pain that we go through just to do anything that relates to hardware, like in this office, is like extraordinary. Like we can never imagine how anything ever gets built in hardware because it's just so difficult. It's called hardware, right? I mean, maybe we should realize that. But so a big part of what I think needs to be solved is not just the networking layer, although that's a critical piece, but also solving like making it easier for people to build the things. Like if it requires tens of millions of dollars and, you know, electrical engineering expertise at all levels in order to like do anything, then I think that the scope of what can get built is limited, right? And what we saw in web and mobile sort of application space was a good example for that. You had people who didn't even really think of themselves as like software engineers, being able to just build an app and solve a problem, and then eventually go hire a bunch of software engineers when they needed them later. But get things going and get things started and start businesses and start solving problems. And that's where I think really IoT needs to get. Networking is a huge part of that. And then I think tooling and just thinking about it from a non-electrical engineering eye is actually like a really, really important concept.
For those listening that are not familiar with how difficult hardware is, it would be like Uber trying to start its ride-sharing business, but have to invent the car also.
Yeah, so I had a great opportunity to listen to Jeff Bezos talk recently in person, which was awesome. Thanks, Vinod. And part of what we got to hear there was that if Amazon had to build UPS, right, and a credit card processing company, they could never have done it, right?
Yes.
Like there was no way for them to build their business if they had to also build logistics and payment processing and all the other stuff that they ended up doing. And so I thought that was a really interesting, and Jeff Bezos now wants to go into space and build, space infrastructure, which is kind of interesting. But it's like that, right? The people building hardware projects today have to build all of the bits. Some bits have now been a little bit solved, but for the most part, you're in no man's land, like reading books that make very little sense. So yeah, so I think it's like, if we can remove those barriers, then I think more people will build more stuff and we'll start to see more interesting developments.
Salle, we wanted you to come on because we thought Uber is a great way to articulate the concept of a two-sided marketplace. Now, the conversation topic is decentralized marketplaces, and I think blockchain, influencers in the social sphere would probably argue with us that Uber isn't truly a decentralized marketplace because Uber is still the middleman. So given that you've sort of seen and grown up with Uber and you're now starting to dabble in blockchain, could Uber work sort of in a properly decentralized way and not exist anymore? Could Uber eventually become non-existent if blockchain could solve some of these trust issues and scale issues and security issues?
I think that certainly the hope of some at Uber was that it would not have to participate in an active way over time. What we found in Uber, and it may not be the perfect corollary for blockchain, because what we found over time is, again, Uber was constantly engaged in trying to solve the customer problem, right? How do we make the system really work for the customer? And, also, as you guys have seen, it's starting to understand and work on the driver. Like, how do we make sure that the experience is also good for the driver? So on both sides of that. And that actually takes a lot of touch. It actually takes some, at Uber there was, and they've talked publicly about this, there's a lot of data analysis to try to figure out where supply is, where demand is, what drivers like, what riders like. And that has taken a bit of human intervention. I think in a perfect world, that will go away as the machines learn more. As a lawyer, I don't know exactly where that point is.
I think it is actually, it's sort of interesting you say that though, because I think it's one of the most poorly solved problems in the blockchain space is this user experience thing. It's not designed for people to actually use it in some way, right? They're for sort of very elegant computer science solutions. And if I challenge someone to set up a Bitcoin core node, it would be extremely difficult, right? The user interface to it is not designed for people to do that, and you could argue that they aren't supposed to do that. But it's a part of the blockchain community and the blockchain ecosystem that I think is very, very underserved. Is this notion that the customer needs to sort of be first at some level, and that's always true, right? And I think if you looked at something like Coinbase as a good example, wildly successful because they made it extraordinarily easy to interact with the blockchains, basically, right? Like to buy and sell tokens or coins. And so I think that would be a big part of the story for blockchain sort of going on is like, how do you make it more customer centric, right? Because it can't just be this sort of playground for geeks. Otherwise, I think it lives in a little bit of a box.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, we have a lot of questions actually. So I think why don't we go to some of the questions online and try to tackle some of those. We have one, Salle. We'll start with you.
Okay.
Person asks, I'm interested in the difficulties in scaling both sides of the market, both the drivers and the riders at the same time. So you don't have surpluses and you don't have, you don't have surpluses and you don't have bad experiences. So in a geo launch, the best way to handle, what was sort of the best way to handle the geo launch? How do you couple this with marketing? And if you need supply, if you need to ramp up suddenly, how does that work?
So I think in the early days, it was fairly simple. I think in some respects, ride sharing had an easier problem because the problem was very apparent, right? I think we've all kind of faced that pain point. I certainly did. The way that I got to Uber is I tested the product from my house. I live in Noe Valley, and on a Sunday, I may or may not get a taxi back then, right? Yeah. And so I tested it, and I got a black car within 8 minutes, and I was like, that is awesome. So if you tell somebody in San Francisco right now that a car is coming in 8 minutes, people would be like, hell no, I'm going somewhere else, right? But 8 minutes back then was great. Yeah, it was awesome. But again, so from the rider side, the problem existed, and it was easy to, we just needed to get the marketing out there, let people know about the product, and they were coming on, and it was a very viral product. People would tell their friends about it. You probably had dinner conversations about it. On the rider side, on the driver's side, we did, in the early days, it was easier because, again, they were just filling up downtime. And so this was, again, a bit of gumshoe work of going out there and saying to drivers, please use our app. It's free to download, and then here's how you're going to make 30% more. But I think as more and more people came on, that problem of positioning supply and demand became more difficult. Yeah. And that's when you have to think about incentive structures. And usually what that means is money, right? And so you create periods of time where drivers can make more money, or they get incentives for doing more trips. And again, this was an effort to try to make that experience good for drivers, but also for riders. And also bring that time down, where like now we all expect 2 to 3 minute pickups anywhere in San Francisco.
If it's over 2 minutes, just cancel it. Yeah, that's right.
I do that. Exactly.
Right. There's no car outside, I'm canceling. Right. So Amir, we have a question for you. Can you guys consider adding the Bay Area to the initial city of nodes? San Jose, Sunnyvale, Cupertino, Santa Clara, Palo Alto as examples.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we're working with San Mateo County. That's right, which you may have seen. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, our certainly because we live here and work here, it's going to be sort of naturally just sort of one of the first places that we focus on. But yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. Another question for you, Amir. Why did Helium create its own alliance instead of joining one of the many that already exists at the moment?
It's a good question. I think we had many internal debates about this as well. So it certainly isn't and the sort of the front part to that question is like, why did you build your own wireless protocol, I guess, and why did you not use something that's already out there? I think for us, sort of, it goes back to a little bit of what I was describing with the business models of some of the entities involved, right? So if I looked at, so the most popular alliance in this space, or the most popular technology in this space right now is probably LoRa, right? And there's an alliance called the LoRa Alliance. And LoRa is a great piece of technology, but again, it's a proprietary piece of technology owned by Semtech Corporation in San Jose. And we just don't view that as the right way to build properly decentralized systems, right? Our desire is that anyone, anywhere can use practically any compatible radio, which is basically any sort of sub-gigahertz radio that exists, to participate in this network. And they shouldn't have to be pigeonholed into a particular brand or a particular company, or they shouldn't have any dependency on a single entity. I think if you looked historically at how networking especially has evolved, I think there was a period of time where people thought NetBIOS and SNA and ATM, and like these were the things that everyone expected were going to win. And then TCP/IP ended up winning that battle. And in hindsight now, it sounds ludicrous to imagine that you ever would have depended on a single company to be the supplier of something that eventually got so big. And I view IoT in the same way, whether it's LoRa or Sigfox or RPMA or like any of the technologies. They're all really good technologies, but they all fundamentally depend on a single company existing in order for you to use them. We just don't view that as a viable plan for how IoT gets big.
What's the killer app, Amir, that's going to lead to mass or increased adoption of IoT?
To me, it's the tile that works anywhere, right? I think the little tracking device that you can attach to anything that works beyond the range of a phone, right? Like almost everyone I speak to, and it's probably because we live in the Bay Area, has a tile device, a tracking device, but they only work in, I don't know if you have one or not.
I don't, but I often want to put one on my kid.
Right, exactly. But it will only work in range of phones or someone that's running a tile app. And so I think this notion of like this sort of ubiquitous tracking that's very power efficient, that can be attached to anything, That to me is a game-changing thing. And I think ultimately, if I thought about what I would love for Helium to accomplish, it is to enable like this new class of application that can't really exist today, right? There isn't a thing that exists today that allows for an extremely cheap way to track a device that runs on a coin cell battery for years, that costs just a few dollars to make. Like, it just doesn't exist. There are components for each of those bits, but there isn't a complete sort of holistic way to do all of that. And so that, to me, tracking is one of the killer apps. But then there are hundreds of others on top of that I could think of.
Okay, we have another question for you, Amir. How is Helium different from IOTA?
Oh man, IOTA I think has a very sort of tangentially related goal. I mean, so IOTA is kind of an interesting piece of technology. It's a type of, it's not a blockchain. It's a type of decentralized or distributed ledger that looks like a blockchain or sort of works like a blockchain, but it's a little bit different. And their focus has been on these low-power devices as well. Our objective is to build a wireless network, right? And
infrastructure.
Our objective is to build infrastructure that people can use, right? Payment processing and transactions are a part of that. And that's the part that IOTA focuses on. And we focus on like, how do we create network infrastructure, and we design an entire system around that. And I think that's very different than what IOTA is doing, right? They, to my knowledge, have no notion of like building wireless network infrastructure for these kinds of devices. And they focus purely on the payment processing side. So I think in that sense, I view Helium as very complementary to like lots of things out there, because our goal is to not become a currency necessarily as much as to like use a currency to build an infrastructure. And I think that's just a different goal than most of these guys out there.
So the intention for something like IOTA Tangle to run on Helium routers is definitely plausible.
It's feasible that you mean, as far as I understand, with the Tangle and everything IOTA is doing, how the device connects to the Tangle is agnostic for them. They don't really care how it gets there. And so from that perspective, like, yeah, you could use our network as a way to do that for sure.
And here's the last question, maybe to either of you, because this does relate to regulations. What about regulations of telecommunications authorities in the US? Is it legal for individuals to deploy modems/access points and earn token fiat money from that? In other words, is it legal for individuals to give commercialized connectivity services? And MNOs and connectivity service providers, businesses, will be disrupted by this.
They will be disrupted by it, but that's sort of the hope. I think it's a complex regulatory question. I mean, on the one side, you've got sort of the base level of stuff, which is like, do your devices conform with the FCC requirements for operating in unlicensed spectrum, and that sort of table stakes. You've then got sort of the stuff that we were discussing around the FCC, and then if you're not dealing with the FCC, or you're dealing with FinCEN or CFTC, or like which regulator are you dealing with? So it's just a combination of regulatory questions that all sort of get bundled together. The wireless one is the easiest one to solve by far. Like, are you is operating an unlicensed device okay? It's very easy to conform to that specification. There's many labs that will help you sort of get through that hurdle. The other ones are much more complicated. And so the quick answer is like, I think there's a way to do it. And it just, the specific methodology to do it just depends, but we intend to do it in the most upfront and legal way possible, and not take any shortcuts on it.
I think we'll take one more question. Can we set up the Helium router today? If not, when will it be when will we be able to? And is this something we purchase from you or build ourselves, and how much would it cost?
So we have the two different components that are perhaps confusingly named, but the router in our case is actually a software application that is sort of the endpoint for your device data. So you can imagine if you had a bunch of devices out in the wild using other people's gateways, you would want all that data to come to you somehow. And the mechanism to do that is what we call the router. And so that's a software application. It's an open source application, will be available later this year. And the thing that most people think of as a router, we call the gateway, so the actual physical piece of hardware. And that, again, will be available this year, and we intend to sell it for a little bit under $500, so $495. So that's the goal. And we think compared to sort of, it's a weird one because you would compare it to like either something like a LoRa gateway, but it's also somewhat comparable to like a Bitcoin miner or something, right? And so So yeah, we don't know if we think the pricing is good, but there's no real basis to like, there isn't a network creating mining device on the market right now. So it's a little bit hard to tell.
Fantastic. Well, look, I want to thank you both very much. Sally, thank you so much for joining us. I think you really helped us paint a clear picture of the analogy of what Helium's trying to do. It's always hard for us to explain this concept of a two-sided marketplace. So really appreciate your time and your willingness to join us today. And Amir, thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy day. I know besides being CEO, you're also our Uber driver. He gives us all rides home.
That's right.
And so he's a great guy. But for folks online, if we did not address your question, we will answer it via online and get back to you. So don't worry about that. And if anyone is interested, please come to our website, helium.com, sign up for our newsletter, join our Telegram group, and you'll get the latest and greatest about Helium and updates on our project on a technical level. And you'll get updates on, where we're going next with our go-to-market. So thank you all. Thanks for joining us. Much appreciated.
All right. Bye, everyone.